She was behind the stable, curled against the stone foundation with her knees drawn to her chest, and she was making a sound that Warrant Officer Mara Voss had never heard before. Not crying exactly. Crying was something Mara knew. Crying was human, it had texture, it stopped and started, it ran out eventually. This sound was older than that. It rose and fell on a frequency that she felt behind her sternum rather than heard with her ears, a low harmonic moan that vibrated in the mortar between the stones, and when Mara stopped walking and listened, she understood that whatever was producing that sound had been making it for a very long time. She did not move. She stood in the blue-gray pre-dawn, 3 meters from the corner of the stable, and she let the sound settle into her. The stable was on the edge of a Vreth military compound, somewhere in the middle continent of Aknar IV, which human survey designations called a Class II contested zone, and which the Vreth called, in the closest translation Mara's linguistics implant could manage, something like the place where the second dying happened. The compound was half destroyed. The strike team that Mara had arrived with 6 hours ago had seen to that. She was the only one left breathing in her unit. She suspected that fact had not fully arrived yet, the way large facts don't, the way they wait in the lobby of your brain until the rest of you is ready. She took a step around the corner. The Vreth female was perhaps 2 meters tall in her compressed position. They got larger standing. This one's gray-green hide had gone dark with something, moisture, or the biochemical analog of moisture that passed for tears in Vreth physiology. And her crest, the chitinous ridge that ran from the crown of the skull to the base of the neck, was lying flat against her spine rather than standing, which Mara's implant flagged as a submissive grief posture. Her hands were pressed flat against the stone on either side of her, the 4 thick fingers splayed wide, and Mara could see the claws were broken on most of them, the way a human's fingernails break when you dig at something long enough. She stopped about a meter away and sat down. Not beside her exactly, not close enough to be a threat, not far enough to be a dismissal. Mara sat down with her back against the same wall, knees bent, rifle across her thighs with the barrel pointed away, and she looked out at the compound and said nothing. The sound continued. The Vreth female did not look at her. This was not in any protocol Mara had received. The mission brief had contained 47 pages on Vreth combat doctrine, 12 pages on the compound's layout, and 1 paragraph, 1, on civilian presence protocols, which essentially boiled down to do not engage, extract yourself, do not present as a threat. It said nothing about sitting down. It said nothing about what to do when the war had run out and you were left in the rubble with a creature making a sound like a planet grieving. Mara pulled off her helmet. The cool air of Aknar IV hit her face. It smelled like wet metal and something sharper underneath, something biological, the iron and resin scent of a place that had been a home before it became a target. The sound changed, marginally, a half step in its frequency, a slight hesitation. The Vreth female had noticed. "I'm not going to do anything," Mara said. Her voice was flat with exhaustion, and she meant it to be. She'd learned long ago that animals, and she didn't mean that as an insult, she was thinking in a purely neurological sense, the part of any creature that read threat and safety and everything in between, could hear the difference between a lie and the truth in the texture of a sound before they could parse the meaning. The quality of her voice when she said those words was the quality of a person who had run out of reasons to pretend. The Vreth female looked at her. They had eyes that sat wide on the skull and could move independently, the way a gecko's could, but in the grief posture both eyes were directed forward, and Mara met them. Yellow-gold irises. The pupils were vertical and very dilated in the low light. There was nothing unreadable about the expression on the alien face. Mara had spent enough time in enough war zones to know grief when it looked at her, regardless of the architecture it lived in. She looked back at the compound. "Bad morning," she said. Her name was Sherath. Mara only learned that 3 hours later, When the sun had come up and the smoke from the eastern barracks had thinned to a pale gray thread, and she had not moved and Sheriff had not moved, and neither of them had done anything except exist in parallel. It wasn't that Mara had made a decision to stay. It was more that she hadn't made the decision to leave. Her extraction window was long past. Her comms were damaged. One of the Vreth cluster mines had caught her transmitter housing during the firefight in the outer ring, and the whole left side of her pack was now a collection of expensive slag. She couldn't call anyone. She probably could have walked toward the extraction point, but she hadn't done that either. She'd sat against the stable wall and watched the morning come in, and listened to the sound Sheriff made become, very slowly, less like a frequency and more like a voice. The Vreth language had two registers. Mara's implant covered the high register, the one used for communication, commands, tactical chatter, everything the military had deemed necessary to understand. The low register, the deep one Sheriff had been using, was listed in the implant's documentation as ceremonial non-functional and flagged for collection only, no real-time translation. Mara listened anyway. The low register felt, if she had to put a word to it, like something her body already knew, like listening to a sound you couldn't name but had been hearing all your life. When Sheriff finally spoke in the high register, it was a single word, and the implant gave it to Mara as companion. Mara considered that yours. Not anymore. Mara nodded once. I'm sorry. Sheriff looked at her with the gold-irised eyes. Mara had a feeling the alien was searching for the lie in it, the way any creature would, the way she'd done herself when people told her they were sorry after her brother shipped home in a box from the Kepler Corridor campaign. The searching went on for a moment, and then something in Sheriff's posture shifted. Not release exactly, but recognition. You have also lost, Sheriff said. Tonight and before. Sheriff pulled one hand away from the stone wall and looked at the broken claws. Her crest shifted, a slight rise. Mara's implant flagged, contemplation processing. Why do you sit? Sheriff said. You are the enemy. I don't know, Mara said, which was mostly true. The other part, the part she didn't say, was that she had been asking herself the same question for 3 years now, in different forms, in different ruined places, and the answer kept changing and she kept sitting down anyway. Before Aknar IV, before this compound, before this morning, there had been 11 months of a different kind of work. She had been embedded in a Vreth border settlement called Thresh Varath, under civilian cover, posing as a cultural researcher attached to the Kepler Xenolinguistics Exchange, which was a real organization that did real work, and which the I detachment had been quietly running intelligence through for 6 years. Her cover was solid enough that she'd been genuinely welcomed, given a small room above a food preparation facility, fed things she couldn't identify that tasted better than anything on base, and assigned a language tutor. The tutor was a young Vreth academic named Aleth Kine, who had studied human linguistics at something analogous to a university on the Vreth homeworld, and who was, it became immediately apparent, considerably more interested in the theoretical architecture of phonemic drift across contact languages than in whatever an intelligence officer needed to record and report. He corrected her pronunciation 11 times in the first session with the patient ruthlessness of someone who truly cared whether she got it right, and when she made a cultural error, she'd used a past tense construction in a context where the Vreth used a present permanent, because human and Vreth grammatical time were differently shaped. He laughed, a Vreth laugh, a long falling click tone, and said, Your people believe the past is behind you. We believe it is inside us. Neither is wrong. They are different places to keep a thing. She'd written that down. She'd written most of what Aleth Kine said down, not for the intelligence reports, but because she was a linguist first, and some things are worth keeping for their own sake. The intelligence reports had contained other things. The names of command personnel, the locations of communication arrays, the access frequencies for the regional Vreth strategic network, which she'd obtained through what her handler had called a social engineering approach, and what she called a friendship she'd been paid to exploit. Because Alethkine had a younger sibling who worked in the network facility, and who trusted Alethkine, and who Alethkine therefore trusted implicitly. She'd filed the reports. She'd watched the friendship she'd been paid to exploit continue in good faith on one side. She'd noted that Alethkine's sibling had been transferred to the facility at Aknar IV 3 weeks before the mission that had brought her here. She had not put that in a report. She didn't know if the sibling had been in the compound when her team arrived. She'd been in the outer ring, and the outer ring was where the professionals were. The people in the inner buildings were. She had not looked at the inner buildings too carefully. She had operated in the outer ring and done what she'd been sent to do, and then Danae had died with his hand on her sleeve, and the rest of the night had happened, and now she was here. She thought about Alethkine, about the word for the past being inside you. Corporal Danae had been 23 years old. He was from a small settlement in the northern agricultural belt of Callisto Station, and he talked about it constantly, the way people talk about places they love, with the particularity of someone describing something to a person who will never see it. He knew the names of the people who ran the food stalls. He knew which tunnel sections were drafty in the winter cycle, and which smelled good when the hydroponic bay was flowering. He had a wife named Manita, and they were expecting a child, and he carried a physical photograph, not a digital one, in a flat case under his armor, which Mara had thought was ridiculous, and which she now found devastating. 2 hours before the end, sitting in a drainage channel watching an Vreth patrol pass 40 meters away, he had said, "I'm prepared to protect my world, you know. That's all. It's not that complicated." He'd said this with the quiet intensity of someone talking himself into something he already believed. A world where I can call Manita on a Tuesday for no reason, where I can throw out leftovers because I'm full and I want to. Where my kid can be boring and normal and never think about any of this. He gestured at the compound, the war, the whole enterprise. "That's it. That's all I've got." "That's enough to have," Mara had said. "It really is," he'd said. And she'd seen on his face what it meant. The enormous, ordinary love of a person who had decided the world was worth protecting, not in the abstract but in the specific, in the Tuesday calls, in the leftovers, in the child who would be boring and normal, and who would never know what their father had traded. She'd thought about that in the outer ring after. She'd thought about what Danae's child would be told, the careful language of loss that the military used, the words that were technically true and emotionally sealed, the way the high register could carry the fact of something without carrying the weight of it. She'd thought about how sometimes the truth needed the low register to survive. The thing she knew, which she hadn't said to Sherath, was this. She'd been watching Vreth die for 3 years, and she'd stopped, somewhere in the 2nd year, being able to tell the difference between an enemy and a person. That wasn't in the operational handbook. That was the kind of thing you developed quietly, like a tumor, and kept to yourself. She was a linguist before she was a soldier. That was how she'd ended up in eye detachment to begin with. She had a gift for sound, for the architecture of meaning beneath sound, and the military had decided that was a useful weapon. She'd spent the first 6 months of her deployment in a transit facility on Helix Station, learning the high register from a Vreth prisoner, who was being very cooperative for reasons that nobody examined too closely. She'd learned the grammar, the syntax, the click consonants that the human throat couldn't quite manage, and that her implant helpfully bridged. She'd learned it the way you learn any language, by understanding that inside every word is a history, and inside that history is the shape of how a people decide to be alive. What she hadn't been told, what wasn't in any of the 47 pages, was that the high register was not the whole language, that there was a lower stratum, that the Vreth had 2 grammars, one for the world above, one for the world below. She'd started noticing it in the field. Before firefights, in the settlements just before they went wrong, there was always a sound, a subsonic hum passing through a population, the kind of thing that made her teeth ache and her implant flag as non-functional. She'd filed a report about it 14 months ago and received back a 3-sentence response that amounted to, "Known phenomenon under study, continue operations." She'd kept listening anyway. That was the thing about her, she kept listening. And she'd started to hear a pattern. Not the grief sound, not the community hum of ordinary Vreth life, but something else. A signal with intent in it. A frequency that didn't rise from the settlements themselves, but arrived before the settlements went wrong, woven into the communication channels like a note in the margin of a letter, something small enough to overlook and precise enough to do damage. She'd started charting it 6 months ago, every instance she could identify. She'd started building a phonological map, and then she'd found the classified annex files. "Why did you come here?" Shareth said. Not hostilely. She seemed to have moved past hostility into something more like genuine inquiry. The sun was high now, and she had straightened from her compressed position, her crest partially risen, and Mara could see how large she actually was. The grief hadn't left her, but it had settled from a storm into a weather. Mara thought about how to answer that. The technically accurate answer was, "I was sent." She had orders, a mission, a chain of command that terminated at some general on a ship somewhere who had signed a piece of paper. She was a warrant officer in the I detachment of the Allied Expeditionary Force, and she went where she was sent, because that was the agreement she'd made. The less accurate but more honest answer was, "I don't know anymore." "I was following orders," she said, "and I don't think that's a good answer, but it's the true one." Shareth made a sound that the implant didn't fully translate, but that Mara's body registered as something like a dark laugh, mirthless and recognizing. "Yes," the Vreth said. "Our warriors also say this." "Does it work?" "No. It is what you say when you have stopped asking why." Mara looked at her rifle across her knees, high-capability weapon, designed by people who had never personally held one in a place like this. "I'm a linguist," she said, "originally, before they decided that was a war skill." Shareth's crest rose a half-centimeter. "Interest. You study our language." "The high register. I was told the low register was non-functional." She paused. "I don't believe that anymore." Something moved through Shareth's posture that the implant did not have a category for. All 4 of her hands went still. Her crest rose fully erect for the first time since Mara had found her, and then just as suddenly it flattened again, and she turned to look at Mara directly with both eyes independent, one for each of Mara's. "Who told you this?" she said. "Command." "Why would they tell you this?" "I've been thinking about that," Mara said. "I've been thinking about it for a long time." It had taken her 14 months to hear enough of the low register to begin to understand it, and another 4 months to understand what she was understanding, and then 3 more months of filing reports that went nowhere to accept that the nowhere was intentional. The low register was not ceremonial, it was not non-functional. It was the second grammar of the Vreth, the deep one, the one that did not translate to commands and tactics but to something older. Something the human nervous system, which was not that different underneath. None of them were. They'd all been built on the same ancient substrate of threat and safety and belonging and loss, could feel before it could understand. And someone at some level above Mara's pay grade had known this for a long time. She'd found the annex files in the 2nd month of the Threshvareth assignment, buried behind a security classification that she'd cracked by accident. She'd been searching for linguistics research abstracts and had used a search term that tripped a cross-file link. And then deliberately, because the fragment she'd seen was specific enough to need context. She'd spent 4 days being very careful about how she accessed them. Then she'd spent 3 weeks wishing she hadn't. The low register carried what she'd come to think of as carrier signals, emotional infrastructure. The deep coherence that let a population move as a single body, The thing that made a settlement feel like a settlement rather than a collection of individuals. The Vreth used it unconsciously, the way humans used body language, the way a crowd's mood moved through a room before anyone said anything. But it could also be engineered. That was what the Annex files told her. Someone had decoded the grammar of the low register, the way you could arrange frequencies to carry not coherence but disruption, not community but fracture, not the sound of a people holding together but the specific vibration that made them turn. The research was not new. The earliest documents in the Annex were 12 years old, predating the current conflict by 7 years. She'd understood then why the Vreth territories kept falling into internal conflict before the AEF even arrived, why the mission briefs always described pre-existing civil instability, why there was always already a war in progress, already a population half destroyed before a single human ship entered the system. Someone had been singing the Vreth into killing each other, and someone had decided that the linguists who would have recognized it didn't need to know. She'd spent 3 months filing reports that went nowhere. Then she'd come to Aknar IV, and her team had gone into a compound that was a tactical relay station and also a home, and now she was sitting next to the thing she'd come to destroy. "There is a man," Sheriff said. "Among your people, we call him the voice that unmakes." Mara went very still. "He came to territories before your armies, not every territory, but the ones that fell hardest." Sherath's crest rippled, something that cost her. He spoke in the deep grammar. He told our bodies that our neighbors were consuming what our children needed. That is not a thought. It is older than thought. It is the voice in the blood that says, there is not enough and they are taking it and they will take your young. He did not say these words. He sang the frequency of them through the channels we used for agricultural coordination, for weather broadcasts, for the ordinary traffic of a people who trusted that ordinary traffic was safe. And then we did not need your armies. We had already done most of it ourselves. Sherath looked at the ruined compound. My companion was killed by our own people 6 months before your ships came. We had been receiving the signals for 4 months before that. I have sat with that fact every day since, and I cannot find the bottom of it. Mara's hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat on her thighs. She thought about the Vreth general from Heth province 8 months ago. The man she'd interrogated in a processing facility, a decorated officer who had ordered mass executions in his own territory and who, when she'd sat across from him in the small room with the recording equipment running, had not looked like a monster. He'd looked like someone surfacing from a drowning. He described the signals in the communication channels as a conviction, a certainty that had arrived fully formed and that he had not questioned because you don't question air. He'd said, I believed it was necessary. I believed they were consuming our reserves. I believed this completely. The reserves were full. They have never not been full. He'd put his head in his hands and the recording equipment had caught the specific silence of a man who couldn't find the bottom of himself. She'd written that report. It had gone nowhere. Do you know his name? She said. The voice that unmakes. Your people would know him as a name. We know him as a presence. A sound. He left echoes in the settlements he walked through, in the frequencies, even after the signals were removed. Our deep listeners, our linguists, you would say, they could identify where he had been the way you might read a footprint in soil. What did the echoes sound like? Sherath turned to her. Would you understand if I showed you? Yes, Mara said. I think I would. The sound Sherath made was low and precise and nothing like the grief sound from the morning. This was deliberate, constructed. Mara heard it in her chest first, and then in the back of her jaw, and then in the older parts of her that lived below language, and what it did there was nothing she would have been able to predict. It made her think of scarcity, not abstractly, viscerally, her resources, the specific face of Corporal Dene, who had caught a round from a Vreth sidearm in the outer ring and had died with his hand on her sleeve, and for 2 seconds, 2 full seconds before she recognized what was happening and put it down deliberately like setting a tool on a table, she felt the beginning of a rage at him that had no reason to exist. A rage that said he took something from you. A rage that dressed itself in the language of threat. She put it down, carefully, and then she sat with what remained, which was the architecture of the thing, the skeleton of how it worked, visible now that she'd felt it from the inside. I heard it, she said. Her voice was level. I felt what it wanted me to feel. Sharath was watching her. It's a lie, Mara said. The whole signal is a lie. It borrows the real fear, the actual prehistoric fear about scarcity, the thing every nervous system carries because every nervous system that didn't carry it is extinct, and it points it at whoever is standing nearby. She was working it out as she spoke, the way she worked out a grammar, finding the rules underneath. It uses a real frequency to carry a false direction. That's the engineering. That's why it works even when you know it's wrong. The meaning is underneath the cognition. You can't think your way out of it. You have to hear it, recognize it, and put it down. And you can only do that if someone taught you what it sounds like. Our deep listeners called it the death grammar, Sharath said. The arrangement of sound that activates the oldest fear in living things. Every species that has ever developed language has a version of it. The frequency changes, but the meaning is the same. You can say kill your neighbor in any grammar that exists if you know which note to strike. Killing grammar, Mara said. Yes. Mara thought of the classified annexes, the mission briefs, the one paragraph on civilian presence protocols, 47 pages on how to kill and one paragraph on how not to. She thought of Dene and his photograph and his Tuesday calls and his child who would be normal and boring and safe. And she thought about what that child would be told, and she thought about Alethkine, who had taught her about the past living inside you, and whether Alethkine's sibling had been in the inner buildings. She thought about the word nowhere, and what it meant when nowhere was a choice someone made. She sat with all of this for a moment. The compound was cooling into the afternoon. A piece of the eastern barracks wall had come down sometime in the last hour, and the sound of it falling had been the sound of something that had already fallen. I know where the voice that hun makes operates from, she said. Sharath looked at her with both eyes. Not a person, Mara said. Or not only. A program. The death grammar exists in the strategic communication infrastructure that precedes every campaign, embedded in the maintenance channels that keep the agricultural and weather networks running, because those are the channels every settlement trusts without examining because you don't examine the air. The signals are set to decay after 90 days, long enough to do the work. Short enough that by the time your forces have fallen apart and our forces arrive, the evidence of what preceded it is gone. She paused, letting the words organize themselves. I have the documentation. Everything from the annex files and 14 months of field recording in a packet that I have been carrying in my pack for 8 months, waiting to find someone with the clearance level to make it mean something. She looked at Sharath. I don't have anyone with the clearance level. I have decided that doesn't matter anymore. The silence between them had weight, the specific weight of a decision that can't be unmade. Why, Sharath said, are you telling me this? Because, Mara said, I have been telling my own people for 8 months, and they have been very interested in not hearing it. There was a game Alethkine had taught her, in the 3rd week of her time in Thresh Vareth. Not a game, exactly. The Vreth word was closer to practice with stakes, a language exercise that involved identifying the origin register of a sentence without being told. High register, low register, or a third category she'd had to ask him to explain twice, which he called the crossing register, the grammar used in formal rituals when a speaker was deliberately invoking both levels at once, the conscious mind and the body knowledge together. The exercise was harder than it sounded, because the crossing register could pass for high register to an untrained ear. The difference was in the undertone. a secondary harmonic that most people produced without knowing they were producing it, and that changed the meaning of the surface words the way an expression changes a sentence. The same sequence of high-register syllables, depending on the undertone, could mean, "I agree with you," or "I am required to tell you I agree with you," which were, Alethkine had said, with the air of someone who found this genuinely interesting rather than troubling, not the same thing at all. She'd asked, "How do you know which one someone means?" He'd said, "You feel it before you think it. The body knows the crossing register even when the mind has learned to ignore it. This is why the deep listeners exist, not to translate, but to hear what is being said underneath what is being said." She'd thought about that many times in the months since, in many different contexts, and she was thinking about it now, watching the sun descend over a compound she'd helped destroy, sitting next to a person whose companion she had in some indirect and structural way contributed to killing, trying to figure out what she meant by the things she was about to do. She meant them in the crossing register, both at once, the deliberate choice and the bone-deep thing underneath it that didn't need a reason. The sun was going down over Aiknar IV, and the light had gone the specific orange-gray of a day that had been too long. Mara had not fixed anything. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself, to hold it without varnish. Sitting against a stable wall with a broken transmitter and a packet of classified documents that nobody had wanted to look at was not a solution. It was an argument. Arguments needed to reach someone who could hear them. She spent the next hour transmitting everything she had. The documentation, the annex files, the phonological field recordings from 14 months of settlements before they fell, the recording she just made of Sharath demonstrating the killing grammar and her own biometric response to it, which her wrist unit had captured automatically, and which showed, in clean data, exactly what the frequency did to a human nervous system in real time. She sent it on every channel her damaged comms could still access. Military frequencies, yes, most of those were monitored, and she knew what that meant. But also the civilian science networks, the Xenolinguistics Institute frequencies, the open academic exchange channels that ran between the research stations scattered across human-settled space, because those people were harder to silence than a warrant officer, and because the right language in the right ears had a way of becoming a fact that couldn't be recalled. She thought about Alethkine. She thought about his sibling. She did what she could with the information she didn't have, which was to put his name in the transmission with a note that said, "If this person is in the compound, please confirm status to Kepler Xenolinguistics Exchange, civilian protocols." She might be arrested. She probably would be. She'd made her peace with that in the 2 minutes it had taken to decide to do it, which was faster than she'd expected. It turned out that some decisions don't take long when you've been approaching them for 8 months. What she'd told Sharath was, "I don't know what comes after this, only that it has to come after something." What Sharath had said after a long silence was, "In our deep grammar, there is a concept. The place where the old sound ends is where the new sound can begin. We call it the hearing before speech." Mara's implant had flagged it as the moment of silence before a new word is spoken. She sat with that while the transmissions ran. Sharath was doing something with her hands. Mara looked and saw that she was re-breaking and re-splinting the claws she'd damaged on the stone wall, working methodically through each one, the way a medic sets a bone that healed crooked, not rushing any of it. It hurt. Mara could see that in each small flinch. But the alien did it anyway, because the ones left to heal on their own would heal wrong, and the ones reset now, even though the resetting hurt, would heal true. Mara watched that for a while without saying anything. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Yes." "The sound you made this morning. When I found you, the low register, what was it exactly?" Sharath's hands went still for a moment. When she spoke, her crest lay flat, not in grief but in something more careful, the posture of someone handling a fragile thing. "It is what we call the seeking sound. When a bonded pair is separated, the body produces it without instruction. It is the nervous system calling for the companion's response frequency, calling for the specific note that only the companion carries. A pause. It continues even when the body knows the companion will not answer. The body does not process that information immediately. It keeps calling. How long? Mara said. Different for different bonds. For strong bonds, she stopped. Her crest moved. Sometimes years. I'm sorry, Mara said, and this time the words landed somewhere specific. Your people do not have this sound. Mara thought about the week after her brother died. The specific waking at 3 a.m., 6 mornings in a row, with a sound caught in her throat that she could never let out. It sat there like a swallowed stone. She'd never had a word for it. She'd never had a place for it to go. Humans didn't make the seeking sound, not outwardly, not in a way that could be heard, so it stayed inside doing the same damage in the dark. We have it, she said. We just can't make it out loud. Shareth looked at her for a long time with the wide, independent eyes. That, the alien said quietly, seems very painful. It is, Mara said. It really is. The extraction team came at 300, 2 hours ahead of schedule, which meant someone had received the transmissions and moved quickly, and whether that meant she was being arrested or rescued, she genuinely could not tell yet. She'd heard them coming from half a kilometer out, because after 14 hours in one place, you learned the ambient sound of it, and the sound of boots and AEF tactical gear moving through a ruined compound had a distinct character, purposeful and metallic, and a little too quiet to be careless. She stood up, and then she turned to Shareth. The Vreth female was standing too, her crest fully erect, all 4 hands held open at her sides. Full height, she was a 1/4 meter taller than Mara and considerably broader, and she looked nothing like the compressed grief shape from the morning. She looked like someone who had decided to go on, which was not the same as being okay. It was a different and harder thing. It was the thing you did when okay wasn't available and you went on anyway. I don't know what happens next, Mara said, for either of us. Nor I, said Shareth. The grammar files are out. Some people will hear them who can't be made to unhear them. She stopped. It's not enough, but it's what I have. Shareth looked at her for a moment with both eyes, the independent Vreth gaze that saw 2 angles of the same thing simultaneously. Then she said something in the low register. Brief and precise and aimed directly at Mara, and Mara felt it in her chest and her jaw and the old parts of her, and it did not feel like fear. It felt like something rare, something that didn't have a name in the high register of any language she knew. What was that? Mara said. The implant will not translate it, Shareth said. It is a deep grammar word, but you felt it. Yes. Then you know. The boots were close now, voices carrying in the cold air someone calling her name. Corporal Voss, Warrant Officer Voss. The military used rank because it was easier than learning the rest of you. It is the word, Shareth said, for the sound a new thing makes when it learns to speak. They arrested her, of course they did. She spent 11 days in a holding facility on Helix Station, while people with significantly higher pay grades tried to decide what to do with a warrant officer who had transmitted classified operational intelligence across 6 systems. She was given a small room and adequate food, and a legal advocate who was technically on her side, and who spent their first meeting explaining all the things that could happen to her, which was not a list she needed explained because she had made it herself before she'd sent the first transmission. What they had not anticipated, what nobody anticipates because nobody ever does, was what happened when a linguist sends documents to other linguists. The Xenolinguistics people at Kepler Institute had the killing grammar files decoded in 72 hours, not because they were especially fast, but because 3 of their senior researchers had been independently cataloging anomalous low-register patterns in field recordings from the contested zones, and had been waiting with increasing professional frustration, for someone to give them the missing structural key. Mara's phonological analysis was the key. The decoding went quickly, because the groundwork was already laid by people who'd been listening to the same silence. She'd been listening to and drawing the same conclusions. The people at Meridian University had a full phonological analysis in 5 days. The people at the Vreth Studies Institute, which existed because somewhere along the way a few humans had decided it was worth understanding who they were fighting rather than just how, published a preliminary report in 8 days that used the phrase systematic cognitive weaponization, which was not a phrase any general wanted to see in a journal that civilians read, and which was not something you could unprint once it was printed. On the 11th day, a woman Mara had never seen before came to her room, sat down across from her, and put a tablet on the table between them. The tablet displayed a document that Mara recognized as her own field report from 14 months ago, the one that had been returned to her in 3 sentences. It had a new signature on it. The word approved was stamped across the top. 14 months, Mara said. Politics, the woman said, which was not an apology and wasn't pretending to be. We need you to come to a meeting. Mara looked at the document, at the word approved in red, at the 14 months of nothing that preceded it, the deliberate silence, the nowhere that was a choice someone had made, and that had cost how many people and how many settlements the capacity to choose anything at all. Before I go to any meeting, she said, I need something. The woman waited. The Vreth general from Heth province, the one I interrogated 8 months ago, where is he? A pause, rehabilitation processing. Is he being told what was done to him? Is anyone telling the people who survived the signals what was done to them, that the conflict was engineered, that they were instruments, not monsters? Those are different things and the difference matters. A longer pause, a longer kind of silence. No, the woman said. Then that's the first thing, Mara said. You tell them. Whatever you do with the files, whatever meetings I sit in, whatever comes next, you tell the people who were played what they were played with. A person who did terrible things because someone weaponized their oldest fear deserves to know that the fear was not the truth. It was a signal with an architect. She stood up. That's not optional. The woman looked at her with an expression Mara couldn't fully read. Not hostility, something more careful than that. Something that might have been, underneath the professional architecture, the face of someone who had also been listening for a long time. You understand, the woman said, that this is going to be complicated. I understand it will be complicated. I've understood that for 14 months. What I'd like to understand is whether the complicated part begins now or whether I'm adding more days to the count. The woman was quiet for a moment. Let's go, she said. She went back to Aknar IV 3 months later. Different context, different authorization. Technically a civilian capacity cultural liaison role that had been created mostly, so the paperwork had somewhere to live, with an attached security clearance that was technically temporary and practically permanent. She'd been told not to expect too much. She'd told them not to expect too little. They'd come to an arrangement. The compound was being used by a joint reconstruction team, Vreth and human, which was not something that would have been imaginable a year ago, and which still felt, in practice, like 2 groups of people trying to find the exact right distance from each other. Not too far to seem hostile, not too close to seem naive. The specific careful geometry of learning to occupy a shared space without a shared history of doing so. They were working it out in real time, visibly, the way you work out a grammar you're hearing for the first time. Making errors, making corrections, occasionally making something that was better than either original. She found Sheriff near the feeding stations by what had been the creche. The alien was in conversation with a young Vreth male who had the posture of someone receiving instruction, and when Sheriff saw Mara approaching, She said something in the low register that Mara's implant still flagged as non-translatable. Mara felt it clearly. They stood at the distance that felt right, which was closer than it had been in the dark before dawn, which might be closer still by spring. Things moved at the pace they moved at. You couldn't hurry a grammar into existing. "The deep listeners are coming," Sheriff said. "The ones who survived. They have heard about a human who can hear the low register, more or less." "More or less," Mara said. "You are better at the carrier tone distinctions than the implant. This is apparently unusual for your species, though not unprecedented. There are records of other humans with the capacity. It has never been formally studied." A pause. "For obvious reasons." "Yes," Mara said, "for obvious reasons." Sheriff's crest rose a half centimeter. The angle of her gaze shifted, both eyes redirected, and Mara recognized the expression now, the contemplation processing look that had flagged in her implant on the first morning as an unknown category. It wasn't unknown anymore. It was a face she knew. "The deep listeners want to teach you the full grammar," Sheriff said, "so that the death grammar cannot be built again without humans who can recognize it for what it is. So that there are ears on both sides of the species line that understand what they are hearing." She paused. "They say this will take approximately 4 years." Mara looked at the compound, the reconstruction teams moving through it, the controlled patience of a thing trying to become something different. She looked at the feeding stations, which had been cleaned and were being used again. She looked at the piece of the eastern barracks wall that had been cleared, the stones set to the side, something being built from them instead. 4 years ago, she'd been a graduate student in a university linguistics department, studying vowel drift in contact languages between pre-spaceflight human cultures, certain she was going to spend her life in quiet rooms with dead texts. And somehow she had ended up here instead, standing on an alien world in the specific light of a morning she hadn't been sure she'd survive, with a destroyed compound being rebuilt around her, and a decision in front of her that felt, against all reasonable expectation, like the easiest one she'd ever had to make. 4 years, she said. Is that acceptable? She thought about the sound Sheriff had made behind the stable, in the dark before dawn, the seeking sound, the body calling for what it had lost. She thought about how it had landed in her without asking permission, how she'd recognized it from the inside even before she'd understood it from the outside, because the frequency was older than any language and her body knew what it meant. She thought about Danae's photograph, carried under his armor, and Aleth Kine's voice saying the past lives inside us, and the Vreth general with his head in his hands, and the word approved stamped in red over 14 months of deliberate silence. She thought about the word Sheriff had given her in the dark before the extraction team arrived, the low-register word for the sound a new thing makes when it learns to speak. 4 years is fine, Mara said. I've been known to take my time. Sheriff looked at her with both eyes, the wide independent gaze that took 2 angles of the same thing at once, that saw the surface and the depth simultaneously. This is not true, the alien said. No, Mara said, it isn't. The sun was coming up over the compound. It was a different color here than anywhere else she'd been, more gold than orange, and it caught the fine particulate in the air, mineral dust, reconstruction debris, the slow exhalation of a settlement remembering how to breathe, and made something out of it. Something between light and substance. Something that had a name, probably, in the deep grammar of a people who had been watching this sun rise for longer than humans had been reaching toward stars. She was going to learn that name. She was going to learn all of it. She owed the dead that much. She owed the living that much and more. And somewhere in a frequency below language, in the register that carried what words couldn't hold, the seeking sound still going, as it would keep going, as it did not stop just because you told it to, she stood in the morning light and listened, and let herself be heard. The first deep listener arrived 2 weeks later. Mara had been given a workspace in one of the compound's restored structures, a low building near the former creche that had become an informal meeting point for the joint teams. She'd filled it with the materials she'd been accumulating for months: the field recordings, the phonological maps, the annotated annex files, 14 months of structured listening, rendered into visual spectrograms that meant nothing to anyone without the context, and everything to anyone who had that context and a trained ear. The deep listener's name translated, approximately, as Old Voice. He was ancient by Vreth reckoning, his crest gone pale and worn at the edges, his hide cross-hatched with the kind of markings that came from decades rather than injury. He arrived with Sheriff as escort and spent the first 10 minutes of their meeting standing in front of Mara's spectrograms with both eyes directed at them, independently, not speaking. She did not speak either. She had learned in 11 months at Thresh Varath that there was a Vreth protocol for the beginning of a significant encounter that involved a period of mutual presence without communication, which Aleth Kine had explained as, "We make sure we are both actually here before we begin. Humans," he'd said, "find this uncomfortable. They fill it with words. It is one of the most interesting things about your species." She'd said, "We're afraid of silence." He'd said, "Yes, but you keep trying to be unafraid of it. That is also interesting." She stood in the silence with Old Voice and looked at her own spectrograms and saw them, for the first time, through eyes that had been looking at the same kind of patterns for longer than she'd been alive. Old Voice finally turned to her and said something in the low register directly, and her implant offered nothing. "I felt it," she said, "but I don't have the words yet." He made the low Vreth sound that was a laugh with something serious underneath it. Then, in the high register, slowly, "I said, there is a human standing in our grammar. This is new." "It's new for me too," she said. He looked at the spectrograms again. "You built this alone?" "Yes." "In 14 months?" "Yes." His crest moved in the way she'd come to recognize as acknowledgement that carried more weight than agreement. "The ones who silenced you, did they understand what they were silencing?" She thought about it honestly. Some of them did. Some of them were silencing me precisely because they understood. Others didn't know enough to understand what they were suppressing. They knew it was classified. They trusted that classification made silence correct. She paused. "You don't need everyone to know. You only need everyone to trust the ones who do." Old Voice was quiet. His inner eyelids moved across his eyes and back. "In our deep grammar," he said, "there is a word for this arrangement of trust that allows harm to continue without anyone deciding to harm. We use it specifically for the death grammar, for the way the signal travels not only through channels but through the willingness to not look." A pause. "It describes something all living things are capable of." "What does it translate to?" He considered. "Your high register would say something like, the shape of not tasking." Mara wrote it down. "We have a word for it too. We call it complicity, though yours is more precise. Complicity implies awareness. The shape of not tasking can exist without awareness. That's actually worse." Old Voice looked at her for a long moment. "Yes, you are right, that is worse." His crest rose. "This is why the deep listeners need a human who can hear them, because the shape of not tasking looks the same in every grammar, and the people who build it speak your language." "When do we start?" she said. He said, "We have already started." There was one thing she did not include in any official documentation. Not classified, not dangerous, simply private. On the morning after she returned to Aiknar IV, before anyone else was awake, she went back to the stable. It was being used for storage now, reconstruction equipment and survey tools, and the stone foundation where she'd sat was partly obscured by crates. She moved 2 of them and sat down in the same position, back against the wall, knees bent, looking out at the compound. She sat for 20 minutes and let herself feel what there was to feel. Dene, her brother, Aleth Kine, who had sent a message through the Kepler exchange, His sibling had survived, was in a rehabilitation facility being told the truth of what had happened to him. Alethkine had ended the message with, "I am trying to understand what you did and whether to be grateful. I think I will require time." She had replied, "Take as much as you need." The grief didn't go anywhere. She'd learned by now, in the way you learn things that can't be taught directly, that it wasn't supposed to go anywhere. It was supposed to stay where it was, inside you, in the place where the voice of the other person used to live. The body kept calling on the seeking frequency. The call went unanswered. The call continued. And you went on anyway, because that was what living things did, the specific stubbornness of organisms, to keep calling even in silence, to keep moving toward the sound they couldn't hear anymore. She sat against the stable wall and hummed something, not a Vreth frequency, just an old song, something her mother had sung in the kitchen of a house on a station she hadn't been back to in 6 years, something from before the wars and the deployments and the career she'd built in the service of other people's silences. Simple and specific and entirely human. She let it out into the morning air, the first note of the first language she'd ever learned, and she let it go where it went. The compound was waking up around her. She could hear it, footsteps, low voices, the particular sounds of a place resuming itself. Vreth voices and human voices, the two registers of two different species, high grammar beginning the business of a day, and underneath that, if you listened for it, if you had the ear for it, the carrier hum of something harder to name. She stood up and walked back toward it. She carried her dead inside her, in the place where the voices of lost things lived, and she walked forward into the morning with the weight of them, and the knowledge of them, and the particular human stubbornness that said, "This is how it is, and it doesn't stop you, and you go anyway." The sun was coming up. It made something out of the dust. She was going to learn the name for that. She was going to learn all of it.